In 1854, a church recorded the names of 27 boys who disappeared. There were no bodies, no graves, no investigation. But when the ledger was opened years later, the names weren't written in ink. They were carved into the paper from the other side. In the winter of 1854, a church ledger was found with names written in ink that no one could see. The page looked empty, but when the light struck it at dusk, letters rose from the paper like bruises beneath skin, and every name belonged to someone who had vanished. This is not a ghost story. This is a record. In the hills of western Pennsylvania, there once stood a narrow stone seminary called St. Bartholomew's Institute for Wayward Youth. It was built in 1839, far from the noise of towns, surrounded by tall ash trees that never seemed to lose their leaves at the same time. Parents sent boys there to be corrected, to be reformed, to be saved. Few of them returned unchanged. Some never returned at all. Officially, St. Bartholomew's closed in 1856 after a fire damaged its eastern wing. The records said nothing about deaths, nothing about missing children, nothing about burial grounds, until the ledger surfaced. It was discovered in 1912 when the church basement flooded. Boxes of rotting hymnals and cracked candle holders were being cleared when a worker found a leather-bound book sealed inside waxed cloth. On its cover were the words, "Property of the Master." No author, no signature. Inside were pages and pages of careful handwriting. Baptisms, donations, punishments, and then, the final section, 27 blank pages. Or so they thought, because under candlelight, faint impressions appeared, names etched without ink, pressed so deeply into the fibers that time could not erase them. 27 boys, all listed as transferred. No destination, no explanation, and beside each name, a single symbol, a circle, divided by a vertical line. The townspeople told themselves it was nothing. Clerical error, faded ink, old superstition. But the families who had buried empty coffins knew better, because every one of those names had belonged to a child who was never seen again, and someone had taken the trouble to record them, without ink, without mercy, without leaving a trace. St. Bartholomew's was not large, but it was orderly. The stone walls were thick enough to mute screams. The windows were narrow, placed high so no child could look directly outside without standing on a chair. The boys slept in long rows of iron beds. No doors on the dormitories. No locks on the outside. Only on the inside. The head of the seminary was a man known simply as Master Elias Crow. He was never photographed. There are no confirmed portraits. In letters from the time, parents described him as calm, composed, deeply persuasive. A man who believed suffering purified the soul the way fire purified gold. He wrote sermons about obedience, about the danger of imagination, about how children carried ancestral sin in their bones, and how it must be drawn out. The institute operated under a strict vow of silence after sunset. From dusk until dawn, no boy was permitted to speak. Violators were taken to the lower chapel for correction. The lower chapel does not appear on the original blueprints. But survivors, 2 boys who left before 1854 and lived into old age, mentioned it in fragmented interviews recorded decades later. They spoke of a room beneath the foundation, a room with no pews, no altar, only chairs bolted to the floor, and a ledger placed on a wooden stand. They said Master Crow would sit across from the chosen boy and ask one question: "What truth are you hiding?" If the boy denied hiding anything, the questioning would continue for hours. If he confessed, the questioning would continue longer. The purpose was never to learn the truth. It was to break it. Because Crow believed every child held a secret they did not know they carried. And he believed writing that secret down gave him ownership of it. The ledger, according to testimony, was always open during these sessions. But witnesses said something strange. They never saw him dip his pen in ink. The official term was transfer. Parents received letters stamped with the church seal stating their sons had been relocated to another institution for advanced spiritual instruction. The letters were polite, reassuring. They always included the same line: "Your child has shown special promise." But there was no second institution. Census records from 1850 to 1860 show no sister seminary affiliated with St. Bartholomew's. No property purchased under the diocese. No expansion. Yet 27 boys were marked as transferred in a span of 14 months. That number matters, because the dormitory only held 30 beds. which means nearly an entire generation disappeared. One mother, Margaret Hale, traveled by carriage to demand answers after her son Thomas was transferred in March of 1854. Parish records describe her as hysterical and unsuitable for conversation. She claimed she heard knocking beneath the chapel floor when she was escorted through the building. She claimed she smelled something metallic in the air. She claimed she saw her son's shoes placed neatly beside the back door. But she was told grief makes the mind invent patterns. She was told her son was blessed. She returned home alone. Months later, her house burned down under unclear circumstances. The fire was ruled accidental. What remains undeniable is this. Every family that questioned the transfer lost something within a year. A home, a livelihood, a reputation, or their sanity. The town began to understand the rule without it ever being spoken. Do not ask about the master's ledger. Do not ask about the lower chapel. And above all, do not ask where the boys went. Do not ask where the boys went. Because asking had consequences, and silence was safer. In October of 1856, St. Bartholomew's caught fire. It began in the eastern wing, where records were stored. The blaze spread quickly, though witnesses said the night was windless. Strangely, the flames did not consume the entire structure. They burned with precision. The archive room collapsed inward. The dormitory remained standing. Master Elias Crow was never seen again after that night. The church declared him dead. No body was recovered. The surviving faculty dispersed to other parishes across 3 states. Their records were sealed for 75 years under ecclesiastical privilege, and the land where the seminary stood was abandoned. Locals avoided it. Farm animals refused to graze near the foundation. Children dared each other to step onto the cracked stone where the chapel once rose. In 1889, a farmer attempting to clear the land reported striking something hollow beneath the soil. When he dug further, he uncovered wooden planks arranged in a circle. Not coffins, a chamber. But the digging stopped when the local diocese intervened, claiming sacred ground must not be disturbed. The site was reburied. No official excavation was ever completed. Which brings us back to the ledger. The book that survived the fire. The book wrapped in wax cloth. The book labeled property of the master. Why protect it? Why preserve it? Unless it was never meant to burn. Because here is the detail no one mentions. Those 27 names are not written in ink. They are carved into the paper from behind, pressed through from the next page, as if someone wrote them from the other side. And when modern analysts examined the indentations in 1913, they found something chilling. The pressure marks did not match a pen. They matched something sharper, something thinner, almost like a nail. And beneath the final page, there are scratch marks, as if someone tried to write back. In 1872, 18 years after the last recorded transfer, a man arrived in town claiming he had once been a student at St. Bartholomew's. His name was Daniel Mercer. At least, that's what he said. He was thin, too thin for a man in his 30s. His hair had gone white at the temples, though his face still looked young. He walked with care, like the ground beneath him might shift. Daniel told the town pastor he had been transferred in 1854. He said he had seen the ledger. He said he had heard the scratching. No one believed him at first. Records showed Daniel Mercer listed as deceased in 1855 due to fever. A small gravestone still stood in the churchyard bearing his name. When shown the stone, Daniel stared at it for a long time. "That isn't mine," he said. He refused to explain further. Over the next few weeks, he began speaking quietly to families of the missing boys. He described things he should not have known: birthmarks, broken wrists, a stutter one boy tried to hide. He claimed the transfers were not relocations. They were selections. According to Daniel, Master Crow believed certain children carried what he called the inheritance, a flaw passed down through bloodlines, a spiritual weakness that could infect entire communities. Crow thought he could isolate it, extract it, remove it from the world before it spread. Daniel described being taken below the chapel one night after failing to confess to a crime he had not committed. He said the lower chamber was colder than winter soil. He said the chairs were arranged in a ring. 27 chairs. Only one was empty. He said the ledger sat in the center. And he said something else was there too. Listening. When asked what he meant, Daniel stopped speaking. 3 days later, he vanished. Again. This time there was no grave. Only his coat, folded neatly on the church steps. Inside the pocket was a scrap of paper. On it, a single symbol. a circle divided by a line. The circle with a vertical line through its center appeared nowhere else in church iconography of the time. It was not Catholic, not Protestant, not Masonic. Researchers later compared it to ancient boundary markers used in early European folk traditions, symbols meant to divide the living from the dead. But Master Crow was not known to study folklore. He studied behavior. He kept meticulous notes on posture, tone of voice, handwriting samples. He believed guilt manifested physically before it ever reached the lips. The symbol appears next to every transferred boy's name, and nowhere else in the ledger, which suggests it was not decorative. It was a designation. In 1913, when analysts pressed charcoal dust into the indentations of the blank pages, something else emerged beneath the names. Lines. Faint lines connecting them. Like a web. Each name linked to another in a pattern that did not follow alphabetical order. Nor age, nor date of arrival. The pattern formed something almost geometric, almost deliberate. When the connections were mapped onto paper, they created a circle, divided by a line. The same symbol, but larger, as if the boys themselves were part of it. That discovery was never published. The analyst who made it, Professor Harold Winslow of Pittsburgh, submitted his findings to the diocese. 2 weeks later, he retracted them. Officially, he cited measurement errors. Privately, he told his assistant something different. They were not listed, he said. They were arranged. The assistant asked what that meant. Winslow answered only once. It means the ledger was not recording disappearances. It was completing something. He died of a sudden stroke later that year. He was 46. In 1924, permission was finally granted for limited excavation of the former seminary grounds after heavy rains exposed foundation stones. The dig lasted 3 days. Workers uncovered the outline of the original chapel and part of the Eastern Archive wing. Then they found the lower structure. It was not a basement. It was a chamber built separately, then buried intentionally. The walls were reinforced with brick unlike the rest of the foundation. There were iron rings embedded into the stone floor. 27 of them, arranged in a perfect circle. In the center was a stone pedestal, blackened as if by smoke, though no soot stains marked the ceiling above. No human remains were found. No bones. No clothing. Nothing. Except scratches. The interior walls were covered in vertical lines carved into the brick. Some deep. Some shallow. Grouped in sets of 5. Tally marks. Too many to count. One worker reported hearing tapping while he was inside the chamber. Not from above. From beneath. He refused to return the next day. The diocese halted the excavation that afternoon, claiming structural instability. The chamber was filled in again. Concrete was poured over it. Official statement. No evidence of wrongdoing discovered. Unofficially, one priest involved in the dig wrote in a private letter, "There is no altar in that room. Only absence. And something that feels unfinished." By the 1930s, most direct relatives of the 27 boys were gone. But some bloodlines remained. Strange patterns began to surface among them. Recurrent dreams of narrow windows. Fear of enclosed spaces. An aversion to circles. In one documented case, a descendant of Thomas Hale, the boy whose mother claimed to hear knocking, reported waking every night at exactly 2:17 a.m. for 27 consecutive days. Each time, he felt compelled to write something. When he finally gave in, he found his hand drawing the same symbol over and over again. A circle divided by a line. He had never heard of St. Bartholomew's. The symbol appears nowhere in his home. Nowhere in his church. When shown a photograph of the ledger decades later, he became pale. "I've seen that before," he said. But he could not remember where. Trauma, especially the kind never acknowledged, does not vanish. It lingers. In habits. In fears. In stories told half correctly at dinner tables. The town where St. Bartholomew's once stood has changed names twice. New houses were built. Roads paved over the old carriage paths. But older residents still avoid the hill. They do not explain why. They simply say the ground there feels thin, as if something beneath it is still listening. By the time the seminary opened in 1839, America was obsessed with reform. Reform schools, reform churches, reform minds. Children were seen as clay, and men like Master Elias Crow believed they were sculptors. But Crow's private writings, recovered from letters archived in a neighboring parish, suggest something darker than discipline. He wrote of moral infection, He claimed entire towns could decay because a single corrupted child carried inherited weakness in his blood. He believed sin was not an act. It was a residue, something physical, something transferable. Crow described a process he called extraction. He never defined it clearly, only that it required isolation, confession, and containment of the vessel. The lower chapel was not a place of worship. It was a laboratory of belief. Survivor testimony suggests the chosen boys were brought down one at a time at first. But by early 1854, the sessions changed. They were brought down together. 27 chairs, 27 vessels. Daniel Mercer's account hinted that Crow believed proximity intensified whatever he was trying to draw out. Not punishment, not correction, collection. One letter from Crow to a bishop contains a single unsettling line. The inheritance resists solitude but yields in chorus. What yields? What inheritance? There is no medical basis for what he described, no theological support. Yet the transfers accelerated after that letter, as if he had entered the final stage of something he had been preparing for years. And the ledger did not record confessions. It recorded alignment. There is no official record of what happened on April 17, 1854. But multiple weather logs confirm an electrical storm passed through the region that night, unusual for that time of year. Residents later described the sky as green. They remembered the air feeling heavy, oppressive. One farmhand claimed he saw light beneath the chapel windows long after midnight. Not firelight, not candlelight, something steadier, almost white. If Daniel Mercer's account can be trusted, April 17th was the first night all 27 chairs were filled at once. He said Crow stood at the center beside the ledger. He did not shout. He did not pray. He simply asked each boy to speak his name, one by one. Around the circle, 27 names spoken aloud in the dark. When the last name was spoken, Daniel said the air changed. Like pressure before a storm breaks. The iron rings in the floor began to vibrate. The boys tried to stand but could not. He said the sound began then. Not screaming, not chanting, scratching. As if something beneath the stone floor was answering roll call. Crow began writing, but no ink touched the page. Daniel claimed he saw the paper depress as though pressed from below, as if the names were being written back. And then, he remembered nothing, only waking in the woods miles away at dawn. Alone, 26 boys remained unaccounted for, and Crow marked them all as transferred. The 1856 fire officially destroyed disciplinary records and financial documents. But the Eastern Wing housed something else. Correspondence. Letters between Crow and other institutions. Most of those letters were lost, except fragments preserved in a bishop's private archive. One fragment refers to the threshold nearly complete. Another warns Crow not to proceed without sanction. Crow's reply is brief. Sanction is irrelevant when the design predates us. Predates what? The church? The town? America itself? Historians later speculated Crow may have been influenced by obscure European mystic movements that blended theology with ritual geometry. But there is no proof he belonged to any society. He worked alone, which makes the precision more disturbing. Because geometry appears again when the lower chapel layout is overlaid with star maps from April 17, 1854. A local historian attempted that comparison in 1963. He found the circle of chairs aligned roughly with the position of 27 visible stars that night. The dividing line of the symbol corresponded with the path of the Milky Way across the sky. He published his findings in a small journal. Within months, funding for his research was revoked. He withdrew the article. When interviewed years later, he would only say, "Some alignments are coincidence, and some are invitations." No graves were ever found. No mass burial. No bones beneath the chamber. Skeptics argue the boys likely died of illness and records were falsified to avoid scandal. But disease leaves traces, and 27 bodies do not vanish without a footprint in the earth, unless they were never buried there, unless burial was never the point. The tally marks on the chamber walls far exceed 27. They number in the hundreds, which suggests the chamber was used long before April 1854, or long after, or both. Parish donation records show unusual purchases between 1848 and 1854. Iron restraints. Lime. Large quantities of salt. Salt preserves. Salt purifies. Salt draws moisture from flesh. There are no invoices explaining their use. When questioned decades later, church officials insisted supplies were for winter storage. But winter storage does not require iron rings and stone floors. It does not require underground chambers built separately from foundations. And it does not require a ledger that writes from both sides of the page. Master Elias Crow was declared dead after the fire. Yet no death certificate exists. No burial site. No obituary. In 1861, a man matching his description was reportedly seen in Ohio under a different name. He was preaching about inherited corruption, about cleansing communities through sacrifice of the vessel. When authorities investigated, the man had already moved on. His trail dissolves after that. If Crow survived the fire, what was he continuing? Was April 17th a success? Or a failure he intended to replicate? Because the symbol did not end with St. Bartholomew's. Variations of it appear carved faintly into the beams of an abandoned orphanage in Indiana built in 1863, and scratched into the stone well of a reform school in upstate New York in 1871. No documented connection links these places, except one. Each reported a cluster of unexplained child disappearances within a 2-year span. Each closed abruptly. Each sealed records citing fire or flood damage. And in each case, no bodies were found. It is tempting to dismiss patterns when they stretch across decades. But patterns do not require belief, only repetition. In 1943, nearly 90 years after the fire at St. Bartholomew's, a small parish in rural Ohio prepared to renovate its rectory. Behind a false wall in the attic, workers discovered a narrow wooden box sealed with wax. Inside was a book, smaller than the original, bound in dark cloth. No title on the cover, but on the inside page, written in careful script. Continuation. The handwriting matched samples of Elias Crow's letters from the 1850s. The dates inside began in 1857, 1 year after the fire, which means if Crow died that night, someone else continued his work. The entries were different from the first ledger. No baptisms, no donations, only lists of names. All boys, all between ages 9 and 14, each name followed by the same symbol, a circle divided by a line, and beside it a word, aligned, not transferred, not deceased, aligned. The final entry in the second ledger is dated 1868. 27 names. Again, no explanation. The parish priest who found the book reported it to the diocese. The diocese requested it be sent quietly for review. It was never returned. But before it left, the priest made a copy of one page. He kept it hidden for decades. After his death in 1952, that copy was discovered among his belongings. At the bottom of the page, beneath the final name, Crow had written something new. The threshold responds only when the circle is complete. Crow's obsession with inherited corruption was not entirely unique for his time. The mid-1800s were filled with flawed ideas about bloodlines, moral weakness, and destiny. But Crow took it further. He believed trauma passed invisibly through generations. He believed children carried memories that were not their own. And he believed those memories could be summoned. Not healed, summoned. His method was not medical. It was ritual, isolation, repetition, confession under pressure, sleep deprivation, the breaking down of identity until a child no longer knew which thoughts belonged to him. Modern psychology would call it induced dissociation. Crow called it revelation. If the inheritance could be forced to the surface, he believed it could be removed. But nowhere in his writings does he describe what happens after removal. He only refers to containment. And the lower chapel had no containers, no jars, no relics, only a circle, which suggests the boys themselves were the container. 27 vessels arranged in alignment. But aligned to what? That is the question that haunts every surviving page. Across decades, one detail remains consistent in every account connected to St. Bartholomew's and its suspected sister institutions. A sound, scratching, tapping, from below. Daniel Mercer described it. The excavation worker described it. A farmer in Indiana reported hearing it beneath the orphanage cellar in 1865 before it closed. A night watchman at the New York Reform School claimed he heard rhythmic knocking beneath the well days before 3 boys disappeared. It is easy to dismiss such reports as imagination fueled by fear. But what repeats deserves attention. If the chamber beneath St. Bartholomew's was not a burial site, then what was beneath it? The chamber was built above something older. Geological surveys from the 1924 dig mention unstable soil and hollow pockets beneath the foundation. Natural caves are common in that region, but caves do not scratch back when names are spoken, and they do not press words into paper from the other side. One final note from Professor Winslow, written in the margin of his withdrawn study, reads, "The ledger does not face upward. It faces down, as if it were never meant to record events in this world, but communicate with something under it." The modern town built near the old seminary site rarely mentions its history. The hill is now private property, fenced, unmarked. Children are told it is unsafe due to unstable ground, but locals avoid it even during daylight. One elderly resident interviewed in 1949 described growing up with a simple rule. If you hear knocking under your feet, do not answer. When asked who taught her that rule, she hesitated. "No one," she said. "It was just known." Generational silence is powerful. Secrets do not always survive in words. Crow may have believed intense ritual confrontation could purge inherited fear from the next generation. If so, he underestimated what happens when you force 27 young minds into synchronized terror. The human brain under extreme stress does not cleanse. It fractures. And fractures, when aligned, can echo. Pike never published his findings. In 1954, exactly 100 years after the final transfers, his office burned in a small electrical fire. Only one document survived, a hand-drawn circle divided by a vertical line, pinned to his corkboard. There is a reason circles appear in ritual across cultures. Circles contain. They focus attention inward. They remove escape. Crow's use of the circle may have been symbolic, but psychology suggests something more practical. When individuals sit in a circle and are forced to repeat names, confessions, or shared phrases, their sense of separate identity begins to blur. Group hypnosis. Shared dissociation. If 27 frightened boys were pushed into that state at once, their responses could have synchronized. Breathing, speech, panic. The scratching sound described by witnesses may not have come from below. It may have come from within the chamber itself. From iron rings vibrating. From nails dragging against stone. From paper pressed too hard by shaking hands. And the indentations in the ledger? If Crow pressed the pen without ink while the boys spoke their names in unison, the force of his grip alone could have carved those impressions deep into the paper. But that explanation does not account for one detail. The scratch marks on the back page. The ones that look like letters formed from the reverse side. Letters that analysts in 1913 claimed resembled fragmented words. Words like here, below, still. Whether those markings were coincidence, imagination, or something else entirely, one fact remains. Crow did not erase the names. He preserved them, which suggests he believed the alignment worked. The phrase appears again and again in both ledgers. The threshold. Crow wrote that it was nearly complete before April 17th. He wrote that it responds only when the circle is whole. Thresholds are boundaries, doorways, lines between one state and another. The symbol of the circle divided by a line may represent exactly that, a boundary cut open. But here is the most unsettling detail. In 1956, during routine maintenance on the concrete slab poured over the original lower chapel, a hairline crack formed down the center, perfectly straight, running north to south, dividing the circle of buried stone beneath it. Workers patched the crack. Within a year, it reopened, always in the same place, as if pressure from below were testing the line. Today, the land remains quiet. No official memorial marks the missing boys. No plaque lists their names. But the ledger still exists, locked in a private archive. And under the right light, the 27 names remain visible, pressed from the other side, waiting for someone to read them aloud. All of them, in order, in a circle. Because if Crow believed anything with certainty, it was this. A design once completed does not forget. It waits. The original ledger is kept in a climate-controlled archive under diocesan protection. Access requires written approval. Few receive it. In 1978, a graduate theology student named Michael Arden was granted temporary study access for a dissertation on 19th-century Reform institutions. He expected dry records. What he found unsettled him. He later described the experience in a private journal. The pages listing baptisms and donations were ordinary. But when he reached the final section, he noticed something strange. The air felt colder. Not dramatically, just enough to make him rub his hands together. He angled the book toward the window. The names appeared, 27 of them, indented deep into the paper. He traced one lightly with his finger. He later wrote that the impression felt sharper than it looked, as if the paper had been pierced from beneath, not pressed from above. He counted them twice. 27. But in the corner of the last page, faint and shallow, he noticed something else. A partial indentation, as if a 28th name had begun, but never finished. He did not mention this in his dissertation. He withdrew his request for further access and changed research topics the following semester. When asked why, he reportedly answered, "Some documents don't want interpretation." In the 1980s, a small group of independent historians began compiling data on unexplained institutional child disappearances between 1830 and 1900. They were not looking for Crow. They were studying reform movements. But patterns surfaced. Clusters of 27. Repetition of circle imagery in architecture. Foundations built over unstable or hollow ground. Most cases had reasonable explanations. Disease outbreaks. Poor record keeping. Migration. But St. Bartholomew's stood apart for one reason. The ledger. Most scandals erase evidence. Crow preserved his, which suggests the record was more important than the secrecy, as if writing the names was part of the act itself. Language has weight. Names have power. Across cultures, speaking a name can summon memory, identity, presence. Crow forced 27 boys to speak their names in sequence. Then he recorded them. Then something changed. Whether psychological or something beyond that, the effect rippled. Because even today, descendants of those families report recurring dreams of unfinished rooms. Rooms arranged in circles. Rooms with no doors. Rooms where someone asks a single question. What truth are you hiding? Modern psychology offers one final lens. Trauma passed through generations can manifest in subtle ways. Anxiety without origin. Fear without story. Silence where there should be narrative. If 27 families were told their children had been transferred and dared not question it, that silence would not disappear. It would embed itself in parenting styles, in whispered warnings, in rules children follow without knowing why. Do not answer knocking at night. Do not speak after dark. Do not trust institutions too easily. The hill where St. Bartholomew's once stood is quiet now. Grass grows over concrete. Trees have returned. But silence remains the strongest legacy. And silence, when inherited, feels ancient. Because it is. If Crow believed he was completing a design, what was it? Not a doorway. Not a demon. Perhaps something more human. A proof. He may have wanted to prove that identity could be broken and reassembled at scale. That 27 separate minds could be synchronized into one moment of shared vulnerability. A collective fracture. And in that fracture, he believed something would answer. The scratching reported by witnesses may have been the sound of boys carving their own names into stone in panic, or the sound of iron under strain, or imagination shaped by fear. But here is what remains undeniable. 27 boys disappeared from one institution within 14 months. No graves. No public inquiry. No justice. Only a ledger. If there is a horror in this story, it is not supernatural. It is institutional certainty. The belief that authority justifies experiment. That secrecy protects faith. That children are vessels for someone else's theory. That is the true threshold. The moment when belief crosses into control. The final page of the ledger still contains that faint, unfinished indentation. Archivists confirm it exists. It resembles the beginning of a name. Just a few carved lines. Incomplete. Whether it was a mistake, a tremor in Crow's hand, or the beginning of another alignment, no one knows. But it leaves one question lingering. If the circle required 27, why begin at 28th? Perhaps the design was interrupted. Perhaps the fire in 1856 was not an accident. Perhaps someone tried to stop the threshold from completing again. We may never know. What we do know is this. The master's ledger was not hidden. It was preserved, carefully wrapped, carried forward, as if someone believed it might be needed again. And under angled light, the names remain. 27 boys, pressed into paper, silent, but not erased. If you ever find yourself standing on quiet ground that feels thin beneath your feet, and you hear a faint tapping below, do not answer, because some designs, once started, do not end. They wait.